Okay, so now we're ready to invest our case. As if you recall, I put a little bit of separator behind the cast before I mounted, so it should be relatively easy to pry these off the mountings. Also over here, I prepared the flasks. I've lubricated the flasks with Vaseline, with the exception of the lid, of course. And I got some slurry water, although I don't advise you using slurry water until you're comfortable with this, because it sets very quickly. And I got some plaster and stone and some separators. So I think we're good to go. And I got a surgical blade, as well as my font stock for the investing. And I got some lab putty here that we're going to utilize after the first half of the investment. So I think we're good to go. Okay. So just a final look, as you can see, for the maxillary denture, we're only going to be doing a permanent hard reline. So therefore, this one, we didn't have to cut it back. This has not been removed off the cast yet. It's still intact on the model. This one here, we had to remove it, and we made a spacer for it. Now the spacer is not included in the wax up. The spacer, I don't have it here with me now, but rest assured the spacer is preserved, which we're going to reintroduce back on this model when it's in the flask. Okay? So at this point, I'm just going to pry the models out. They should come out relatively easy because of the separator. If they don't, and they don't usually, I'm just going to take a hammer, and I'll just use my font stock. Typically use something a little more sharp, but just a bit of a tap. That's all it takes, and that separates rather nicely. Okay, so I'll go over here to the air nozzle, and I just want to trim some of the excess separator. And let's just assess how this fits back together. So we have a nice intimate contact, very flush. So I anticipate to see the same thing after the processing. So I can take this one and I'll set it. A nice clean place to set this is actually on the lid of the flask, which I placed upside down. So I typically put my upper on the right and my lower on the left. Just a little sequence of events in my mind that keeps things rolling along. And the lower here, see if this separates. That one separated a lot easier, and that's what I anticipated with the other one. But if it doesn't, you can just give it a bit of a tap with a hammer and a sharp instrument. So back over here to the air nozzle, just to spray off some of the excess separator. And again, take note how things come together very nicely. There's no play at all with this keyway design, so it works very well. And you can certainly do it on the outside if you've seen some other videos, but they tend to break off, so I tend to like these ones. Okay, so I'll set this one here. Mounting goes back on the articulator, and we'll set the articulator on the side, and we'll work with that later. Now over here, we need to separate our models. So just the one coat of separator on the models themselves is sufficient. And again, I've coated these with Vaseline. So I'll do the underside of the casts as well as the sides. That's all you need to do now. You don't need to go on top of the land area, just the sides of the casts as well as the underside. And if you have any excess separator like that, you can just blow it off a little bit with the air nozzle. And again, I'll rest it here. underneath. Get inside the keyways with your brush. Okay, we're good with that, and I'll roll off the excess. Okay. So at this point, we're ready to invest. Half and half. I might end up using slurry water. It all depends. I just want to try to get everything into one shot. I might use a little bit of slurry water over here. So if we look at this bowl here, if I let this sit for about a few minutes, all the sediment will start settling. Okay? Which means you're going to have almost some clear water on the top once this starts to settle. If you empty that clear water, you can make the solution more concentrated. Or if I add more water, I can make it more diluted. This is a pretty concentrated solution, so a little bit of this goes a long way. So I will start by...
This plaster was setting fast today.
Yes. Our good cameraman Tyler here tells me that our plaster is setting really quick today. And I would suspect the reason for that is because the bin that the plaster is stored has been kept open, and there's a lot of humidity inside this room, and therefore it's absorbed humidity from the air, and as soon as I start mixing it with additional water, the setting happens very quickly. So having said that, I'm only going to use a little bit of slurry water, and the remaining will be just water, a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go to the sink. I'm going to follow you over here and do a little bit on a vibrator. That's good. Back to our flasks. Just kind of brush it up against the sides. And then gently kind of wiggle it left and right. I bottomed out, I can feel that there, and as well as this one. Then now, just take my spatula, and this mix is starting to set rather quickly. So I'm just going to use the bench here just to wipe my spatula. I'm not going to be concerned about that because my plaster is setting rather quickly. I'm going to concentrate on this. Wipe it off here. Expose the edge of the flask. And again, do not use slurry water if you're not comfortable working a little bit faster than what you're normally used to, or a lot faster, I should say. Got a bit of a void there, I'll fill that in. And then to this one. So as you can see, this plaster stone mix, 50-50 mix with a little bit of slurry water, set rather quickly. So you better know your business if you're going to use slurry water, otherwise you're going to run out of time very quickly. So make sure that you leave all of the lip of the flask totally exposed and do not create any undercuts. That's good there. And then we'll move over to the sink. And gently we're gonna go over it with our finger to get a nice smooth surface. That's good there. And the lower. All right, that looks pretty good. Just a little bit of a housekeeping here. And this is the mix that's already set. So I didn't bother cleaning it because I would have run out of time doing that, which is okay. I can just crunch it together and get rid of it down. Get rid of my gloves now. They have quite a bit of Vaseline from the flasks on them, so they're rather slippery. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to apply some lab putty around the teeth. So, and the putty, because of the flexibility of the lab putty, it allows us to retrieve the denture base from the top portion of the flask, as you'll see a little bit later on, so we can prepare it in order to do our permanent reline / rebase on the maxillary and our permanent soft liner on the lower. Before I apply it, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the air nozzle just to blow off any moisture. Same thing with the upper. Always a good idea before you start the second half of the investment is to assess that your flasks actually come together like so. And I'm borderline before the lid, but I think I'll get away with it. I'm good. So I'll put it there. And this one, I think this one looks pretty obvious, although it's not really closing. Can you guys see that there? So something is interfering with this flask, and rest assured, if you look over here, there's our little problem right there. It doesn't take much, that little bit. And a little bit over here. So let's see the flasks now, and that's a whole lot better. So they're closing nicely. I'm able to put the lid back on there, so everything closes nicely together. Okay, so you're not gonna top it off with stone as we traditionally do for a new case. This is a little bit different. You're gonna need some gloves for this one, for sure. We're going to use some laboratory putty. This is a shore hardness of 85. There's also 95, but I think this is sufficient. How much do you use? I'm going to do one at a time so I don't run out of time. That's enough probably for one. So maybe the size of a golf ball, I would say. Or a ping pong ball. Might be in there. Sometimes you get a little bit moisture buildup in here. I'm just going to do it here so you guys can see it. No, this one there isn't, so the paste is actually good. So about that much. Not that much. I'll leave that out. The more catalyst you put, the harder it becomes, but also the faster it's set. So you're gonna have less working time. So manipulate the material initially in your fingertips, as you see me do here, and then I like to squish it together in my palm to get a nice even mix like so. So I need to put a layer on the outside, so I'll make almost like a little rope here. I'll leave that to the side, and I'll place it on the outside like that. And the idea here is to squish it up against the buccal and labial surfaces of the teeth, but not on top of the occlusal surfaces, just like so, nice and firm. And I'm using the palm of my hand, and I'll do the same thing on the inside. This one's a bit of a thinner strip, stretching it out a little bit, and I'm going to connect the two, if you can, back here. Right up against the incisal edges, and you notice that I'm exposing the incisal edges as well as the occlusal surfaces of the teeth as much as I can. And now what we want to do, make sure that we're firmly up against the facial surfaces as well as the lingual surfaces. We want to make a cutaway here and create an undercut under this putty. So the putty will be retained on the second half of the investment. And as I'll pull this away, you'll see what I mean in a second. So I've created an undercut in here, almost like a 45-degree. And I'm going to cut a little bit in here. Be very gentle as to not to cut into the wax up. So do this one at a time, because you'll definitely run out of time if you're trying to do both. And just going to take my font stock here, squish it in a little bit and get rid of some of these little projections. A little bit there. And emphasize the undercut. So you have to imagine now the top layer of the stone is going to go on the underside of this undercut, and after we boil this out, this will be retained on the second half of the flask. I want this on the second half of the flask. So if you follow this little approach, I think works out very well. And now I'll do the same thing for the upper. Now notice the upper, we don't have too many lingual undercuts, so you can do without doing putty on the lingual here, but I'm just going to apply, just for safety measure, I'm just going to apply a little bit, not as much as the lower. So once again, maybe about the size of a golf ball. I'm going to use this little extra that I had before, so I don't waste it. And I think that should be enough. So once again, start manipulating the material in your fingertips. And this one might have a bit of a lighter shade of pink, because I didn't use as much catalyst as the other one, so I should have a little more working time. I'm going to save a little bit for the lingual, and I'll leave the most of it for the facial right over here. Just going to place it here, and then just use the palm of my hand and squish it up against the teeth. Make sure it gets all the way inside the margins firmly. And this little bit that I have left over, just make a little rope here and apply it on the lingual side here. Join the two if you can back here, and then squish it inside the lingual without overlapping the incisal or the occlusal. And if you did, you can just, while it still hasn't set, you can go in and scrape it back or cut it back. So once again, I'm going to take my surgical blade and at an angle, just on or maybe outside the land area. Come in here while the material is still soft. Cut it back and peel it off just like that. I'll just scrape it off a little bit like so. Tuck it back in. So this one, we have a much more noticeable undercut. It's a little bit taller versus the lower. And I mean, there's sufficient undercut in here, but if you make it with a sharp ledge, you get a better joint between the lab putty and the stone that you're going to use to invest in. Cut it sharply back here and here. Okay. So this lab putty now will allow us to retrieve the denture base, both top and bottom, from the top portion of the investment after we soak it in boiling water and are able to separate it, because we need to do some further preparation to the denture bases before we can pack them with hard acrylic or the permanent soft liner acrylic. Okay, I'll continue. And the rest of it is very simple. So what we're going to do, we're going to apply some separator on the stone portion. You don't have to put any on the acrylic, and you don't have to put any on the putty. Just on the stone part, there and here. Okay. We can actually put the second half of the flask on here. Number one, make sure it fits. If it doesn't, then cut your putty back. And also this one here, so that fits as well. And it's below the height of the flask. And we're going to mix half and half mix. This time around, I don't need to rush. We're almost done with the video. So I'm just going to use plain water. And I'm going to make it a little more on the runnier side. Bit of a runny mix. And then we'll move over to the vibrator. Vibrate the stone. Good 20-30 seconds. And I like to hold both halves together and actually use a vibrator to allow the stone to flow in there. Nice and slow. Make sure don't get a lot of stone seeping through here. So while I was on the vibrator, I was keeping a lot of pressure with my hand up against the flask here. So I'll set this one to the side, that being the lower, this being the upper. We'll do the same thing. I could have mixed the stone a little more runny, a little bit on the thick side. But we'll make it work. So I'm going to top it off with some more stone, a little more than the height of the flask. It's good there. Spring the lid. And we'll let that set for a good half hour or so before we can soak it into boiling water and are able to separate the flasks, which we'll show on the next video.